"Sir, I'm going to need you to leave the lobby." The sentence cut through the quiet like cold steel against glass. Rain hammered softly against the towering windows of the Ashford Grand Hotel while Elijah Carter stood motionless beneath the crystal chandelier, water dripping from the edge of his dark wool coat onto the polished marble floor. The lobby smelled faintly of cedarwood and expensive perfume, warm against the storm outside, but none of that warmth reached the woman behind the front desk. Victoria Hale kept her chin lifted, manicured fingers resting lightly against the marble counter as her sharp blue eyes swept over Elijah's worn leather bag and rain-soaked boots. Around them, the midnight crowd had gone strangely still. A businessman near the fireplace lowered his whiskey glass halfway. A young couple waiting for the elevator exchanged quiet glances. Somewhere in the distance, soft piano music floated through hidden ceiling speakers, elegant and detached, as if the hotel itself refused to acknowledge the tension tightening the air. Elijah removed one black leather glove slowly, calmly, revealing a broad hand lined with age and work. "I have a reservation," he said. His voice wasn't angry. That seemed to irritate Victoria more than if he had shouted. She gave a thin smile polished by years of fake hospitality. "The Ashford is a private luxury property, sir. We reserve the right to refuse service." Elijah's eyes drifted briefly across the lobby. Gold-trimmed pillars. Imported Italian stone. White orchids near the concierge desk. Every detail had been designed to whisper wealth instead of announcing it. His gaze lingered on a bellhop struggling to carry luggage for an elderly guest. The young employee looked exhausted. Nervous. Underpaid. Elijah noticed that too. "I booked the presidential suite for 3 nights, he said quietly. One man near the bar let out a soft laugh before quickly looking away. Victoria's expression tightened with disbelief. "The presidential suite starts at $12,000 a night." Her words landed carefully, each one dipped in humiliation but wrapped in professional courtesy. Elijah nodded once, as if confirming information he already knew. Rainwater slid down the sleeve of his coat and tapped steadily onto the marble floor below him. "Then I assume the reservation is under my name." Victoria typed sharply into the computer. The glow from the monitor reflected across her face while silence stretched across the lobby. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows lifted a second later. "There's no active reservation under Elijah Carter." She folded her hands together. "Now, if you continue causing discomfort for our guests, I'll have security escort you outside." Elijah glanced toward the massive glass entrance doors where the storm blurred the city lights into streaks of silver and white. He looked tired, but not defeated. The kind of tired that came from years of carrying responsibility without complaint. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I think you should check again." Victoria's patience cracked slightly. "And I think you should stop pretending you belong here." The words settled over the lobby like frost. A woman near the elevators looked down at her phone, uncomfortable. The bellhop froze beside the luggage cart. Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly removed the second glove and placed both hands on the handle of his old leather bag. His reflection shimmered faintly across the polished marble beneath him while thunder rolled low outside the towering windows. Then, somewhere deeper inside the hotel, the private executive elevator chimed. The soft chime of the executive elevator echoed through the lobby, low and elegant, but no one moved. Victoria Hale kept her eyes fixed on Elijah Carter, refusing to let the brief interruption break the control she believed she still had over the room. Behind her, the digital fireplace flickered against dark walnut walls, casting warm amber light across the polished marble floor. Outside, rain streamed down the 30-foot glass windows in silver ribbons, blurring the Manhattan skyline into a watercolor of distant lights. Elijah rested both gloved hands on the handle of his old leather bag and waited. He did not argue. He did not plead. That calmness unsettled people more than anger ever could. Victoria straightened the gold nameplate pinned to her navy blazer. "Sir, I am asking you one final time to leave the property voluntarily." Her voice remained smooth enough for nearby guests to hear professionalism instead of contempt, but the contempt was there all the same. Elijah looked toward the concierge desk where a young Latina employee stood frozen beside a vase of white orchids. She could not have been older than 22. Nervous fingers twisted around a room key card while she avoided eye contact with everyone in the lobby. Elijah noticed the fear in her posture immediately. The kind that came from needing a paycheck too badly to challenge authority. "What is your name?" Elijah asked her gently. The young woman blinked, startled he had spoken to her at all. "Maria, sir." Victoria stepped in sharply before the conversation could continue. "Maria is not part of this discussion." Elijah nodded once. "No," he said quietly. "But she is watching it." Victoria's jaw tightened. Near the lounge bar, two businessmen in tailored suits whispered to each other while pretending not to stare. A woman wrapped in a cream-colored designer coat slowly lowered her phone after secretly recording part of the exchange. The lobby no longer felt welcoming. It felt staged. Artificial. Like a luxury magazine cover beginning to peel at the corners. Elijah glanced toward the grand staircase curving beside the lobby fountain. He remembered when that staircase had existed only as blueprints spread across a conference table 12 years earlier. He remembered arguing for softer lighting in the lobby because cold white lights made tired travelers feel smaller. He remembered insisting every guest should be greeted within 5 seconds of entering the hotel, no matter what they looked like. Now he stood beneath those same lights like a stranger in his own vision. Victoria typed something quickly into the computer terminal before looking back up. "Interesting," she said with a thin smile. There actually was a reservation placed tonight for the presidential suite. A few guests shifted closer, sensing drama beneath the polished surface of the hotel. Elijah remained silent. "Unfortunately," Victoria continued, "the reservation was cancelled 30 minutes ago." The businessman near the fireplace smirked into his whiskey glass. Elijah's eyes drifted briefly toward the ceiling where soft jazz music floated through hidden speakers. Calm music. Expensive music. Designed to make wealthy people feel important. "Who cancelled it?" he asked quietly. Victoria folded her arms. "I did." Silence settled hard across the lobby. Even Maria looked stunned by the answer. Victoria stepped slightly closer to Elijah now, lowering her voice enough to sound personal instead of official. "People spend a fortune to stay here because they expect a certain environment. They expect comfort. Security. Exclusivity." Elijah studied her face carefully. Not angry. Not emotional. Just observant. "And what exactly threatens that environment?" he asked. Victoria's eyes flicked briefly toward his coat, his boots, his dark skin. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. "You know exactly what I mean," she said softly. For the first time that night, something changed in Elijah's expression. Not anger. Something heavier than that. Disappointment. The disappointment in Elijah Carter's eyes lingered only a moment before his expression settled back into calm restraint, but Victoria Hale noticed it. Something about it irritated her more than outrage would have. Angry guests could be removed. Loud people could be embarrassed. But quiet disappointment had a way of making other people question themselves, and Victoria hated uncertainty. She stepped back behind the front desk, smoothing the sleeve of her tailored blazer while the chandelier light shimmered against the marble counter. The storm outside had intensified again. Wind rattled softly against the towering windows, and distant thunder rolled above the city like a warning no one wanted to hear. "Security," Victoria said without looking away from Elijah. A tall man in a gray suit emerged near the entrance hallway almost immediately. His name tag read Daniel Mercer. Broad shoulders. Earpiece. Polished shoes reflecting the gold lobby lights. He approached carefully, though not aggressively. Unlike Victoria, he looked uncertain. Elijah noticed that too. "Sir." Daniel said quietly, I am going to ask you to come with me. Elijah looked at him for a long second before speaking. Do you believe I belong outside? Daniel hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. But the hesitation was there. Victoria answered for him. This conversation is over. She turned toward the guests nearby with a professional smile that looked practiced enough to survive any scandal. Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for the disruption this evening. The businessman near the fireplace nodded approvingly as if order had finally been restored. Elijah slowly removed his rain-soaked coat and folded it neatly over his arm. Underneath, he wore a charcoal button-down shirt and dark slacks pressed with quiet precision. Expensive fabric. Understated tailoring. Nothing flashy. The kind of elegance that did not need attention because it already understood its value. Maria noticed first. Her eyes widened slightly. Victoria did not. She only saw what she had already decided to see. I stayed at this hotel once before, Elijah said softly, almost to himself. Victoria crossed her arms. I highly doubt that. Elijah glanced toward the massive chandelier suspended above the lobby. Crystal reflections trembled faintly across the polished floor beneath them. The lighting used to be warmer, he murmured. Guests lingered longer when the light felt human. Daniel looked at him strangely. Even Maria stopped breathing for a moment. Those exact words had once been engraved inside the employee training handbook years earlier. Victoria frowned. Sir, enough. Elijah reached slowly into the inside pocket of his shirt. Daniel instinctively stiffened, but Elijah only pulled out a small silver keycard worn smooth at the edges. No logo. No room number. Just a plain metallic card that reflected the lobby lights like liquid mercury. He placed it gently on the marble counter between himself and Victoria. What is this supposed to mean? She asked coldly. Elijah did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted past her toward the wall behind the reception desk where framed black and white photographs displayed the history of the Ashford Grand Hotel. Groundbreaking. Ceremony. Ribbon cutting. Charity gala. Magazine covers. In one photograph near the center, a younger man stood beside the original architect shaking hands beneath unfinished steel beams. Rain streaked the camera lens. The image was grainy. Easy to ignore. But Elijah recognized every inch of it. Victoria followed his gaze briefly before scoffing. You think staring at pictures changes anything? Elijah finally looked back at her. Calm. Measured. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with travel. No, he said quietly. But forgetting them usually does. Before Victoria could respond, the executive elevator chimed again. This time the sound was louder somehow, heavier. The polished gold doors slid open slowly, and every employee in the lobby straightened at once. Two men stepped out of the executive elevator wearing dark tailored suits and expressions carved from urgency. The older one moved first, silver hair slicked neatly back, polished shoes striking softly against the marble floor. Behind him came a younger assistant carrying a black leather portfolio against his chest. Every employee in the lobby straightened instinctively the moment they appeared. Even Victoria Hale adjusted her posture. The older man scanned the lobby once, his eyes moving past the fireplace, past the front desk, past the silent guests gathered near the elevators. Then he saw Elijah Carter standing beneath the chandelier with rainwater still glistening along the sleeve of his folded coat. The man's expression changed immediately. Mr. Carter, he said, crossing the lobby quickly. We have been trying to reach you for over an hour. Silence crashed through the room so completely that even the piano music overhead seemed distant now. Victoria blinked once, confused by the respect in the man's voice. Elijah nodded calmly. My phone died during the storm. The younger assistant stepped forward at once. The board members are waiting upstairs. They delayed the meeting until you arrived. Near the lounge bar, the businessman with the whiskey glass slowly lowered it onto the table without taking his eyes off Elijah. Maria's hand tightened around the room key card she still held. Daniel Mercer glanced toward Victoria carefully, watching the color drain from her face one shade at a time. Victoria forced a strained smile. "Excuse me," she said quickly. "There seems to be some misunderstanding." The older executive turned toward her slowly. "And you are?" "Victoria Hale, General Manager of the Ashford Grand." She extended her hand politely, though her fingers trembled slightly beneath the chandelier light. The man did not shake it. "Then perhaps you should explain," he said evenly, "why the owner of this hotel has been standing in the lobby for nearly 20 minutes without access to his room." The words landed like a sudden crack across frozen water. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. One woman near the elevators quietly lowered her phone after recording the entire exchange. Victoria's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Elijah remained completely still beside the front desk, his calm somehow making the moment worse. He did not look triumphant. He looked tired. Deeply tired. The kind of exhaustion that came from seeing the same disappointment too many times in too many places. "Owner?" Maria whispered under her breath. Daniel closed his eyes briefly as if replaying every second of the past 20 minutes in his mind. Victoria finally found her voice again. "Mr. Carter, if I had known who you were," Elijah looked at her quietly. "That is the problem." The storm outside rolled against the windows again, low thunder vibrating softly through the glass walls. Somewhere near the back hallway, a luggage cart rattled faintly before going silent. The entire lobby felt suspended in place. Elijah stepped toward the reception desk slowly and picked up the small silver keycard he had placed there earlier. The polished metal reflected across his fingers like liquid light. "Do you know why I never announce myself when I visit one of my properties?" he asked calmly. Nobody answered. Victoria could barely breathe. Elijah looked around the lobby one more time. At the guests. At the employees. At the fear spreading quietly through the room. "Because luxury is not marble floors," he said softly. "It is not chandeliers. It is not who walks through the door wearing expensive shoes." His eyes settled briefly on Maria, then Daniel. "Luxury is making people feel welcome before you know whether they can give you anything in return." Victoria's shoulders sank slightly. The older executive beside Elijah opened the black portfolio and removed several documents. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully, "the termination forms are prepared if you still wish to proceed." A sharp breath escaped somewhere in the lobby. Elijah did not answer immediately. He simply looked at Victoria Hale while rain continued sliding down the towering glass windows behind him like tears the city itself could no longer hide. Victoria Hale looked as though the marble floor beneath her heels had suddenly turned to water. Her perfectly controlled posture began to fracture in tiny ways first. A trembling hand. A shallow breath. The forced smile disappearing from her face like paint dissolving in rain. Around the lobby, silence deepened until even the soft jazz overhead felt intrusive. Elijah Carter stood beside the front desk with the same calm stillness he had carried from the moment he entered the hotel. No anger. No raised voice. Only quiet disappointment hanging in the air heavier than humiliation ever could. The older executive opened the portfolio carefully and slid several documents onto the marble counter. Thick paper. Gold letterhead. Formal termination notices already signed at the bottom. Victoria stared at them as if refusing to understand what her eyes were seeing. "Mr. Carter," she said weakly, "please. There has been a misunderstanding." Elijah looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No," he said softly. "There has been clarity." The words settled over the lobby like falling ash. Daniel Mercer lowered his gaze immediately. Maria pressed her lips together tightly, trying not to let emotion show on her face. Nearby guests who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact entirely. One businessman quietly picked up his suitcase and moved farther away from the front desk as though distance alone could erase what he had witnessed. Victoria stepped around the counter quickly. "I was protecting the image of the hotel," she said. "That is my job." Elijah nodded once. "And what image is that?" Rain streaked endlessly down the giant windows behind him while flashes of distant lightning briefly illuminated the lobby in cold silver light. Victoria swallowed hard. "We serve elite clients." Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly, though his voice remained calm. "You mean wealthy clients?" She hesitated. "Yes." "No," Elijah replied quietly. "You meant something else." Victoria's face drained again because she knew he was right. The truth had already exposed itself long before anyone said it aloud. Elijah glanced toward the black and white photographs displayed behind the reception desk. "Do you know who the first guests ever welcomed into this hotel were?" he asked. Victoria said nothing. "Construction workers," Elijah answered himself. "Men covered in dust and paint after 14-hour shifts. The kitchen fed them for free the night before opening because this place existed because of their hands." The older executive beside him smiled faintly, remembering. Elijah's gaze drifted across the lobby. "My father was one of them." The room went still all over again. Even the storm outside seemed quieter for a moment. Elijah rested one hand lightly against the marble counter. "He used to tell me something when I was a boy," he continued softly. "He said a building only becomes luxury when kindness lives inside it." Victoria looked down at the termination papers. Her glossy makeup could not fully hide the panic spreading across her face now. "Please," she whispered. "I can fix this." Elijah studied her carefully. "Not with cruelty. Not with satisfaction. Almost with sadness." "You had 20 minutes to fix it," he said. "You had 20 minutes to treat a tired traveler with dignity before knowing whether he mattered to you personally." Maria lowered her eyes, fighting tears. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose as regret settled heavily across his face. Elijah picked up the silver keycard from the counter again and slipped it quietly into his pocket. "Do you know the worst part?" he asked. Victoria shook her head weakly. "You were not cruel because you were angry. You were cruel because you were comfortable." The words struck harder than shouting ever could. Victoria's shoulders folded inward slightly, as if the weight of the entire lobby had finally landed on her chest. Elijah looked toward the older executive beside him. "Terminate the management contracts effective immediately," he said calmly. "Including security leadership." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Elijah noticed and added quietly, "Except Mr. Mercer." Daniel looked up in shock. Elijah nodded toward him once. He hesitated. Silence filled the lobby again while thunder rolled low beyond the towering glass windows and rain continued falling against the city like a sorrow too old to name. No one in the lobby moved after Elijah Carter finished speaking. The storm outside continued rolling across Manhattan in slow waves of thunder, but inside the Ashford Grand Hotel, the silence felt heavier than the rain. Victoria Hale stood beside the front desk staring at the termination papers spread across the marble counter, her shoulders no longer rigid with authority but slumped beneath the weight of realization. The chandelier above cast fractured reflections across the polished floor, turning the lobby into a sea of trembling gold light. Elijah looked away from her and toward the giant windows facing the city streets below. Yellow taxi lights drifted through the rain like fading lanterns. People hurried beneath umbrellas. Horns echoed faintly from 20 floors beneath the glass. Life outside continued as if nothing had happened at all. But inside the hotel, something fundamental had shifted. Maria slowly placed the room key card back onto the desk with careful hands. She looked at Elijah differently now, not because he owned the hotel, but because of how quietly he had carried humiliation without becoming cruel in return. Daniel Mercer loosened his jaw slightly, the tension finally visible in his face. The older executive closed the black portfolio and stepped back respectfully, allowing the silence room to breathe. Elijah rested one hand inside the pocket of his coat while studying the rain sliding down the windows. His reflection shimmered faintly against the glass. Tired eyes. Silver beginning to touch the edges of his beard. A man who had spent decades building something beautiful only to stand inside it tonight and feel like an outsider. "Do you know what hurts the most?" he asked softly without turning around. Nobody answered. Victoria's eyes remained fixed on him, uncertain whether she still had the right to speak. Elijah exhaled slowly. "Not what happened to me tonight." His voice remained calm, but something deeper lived beneath it now. Old sadness. Old exhaustion. It is knowing how many people without power walk through places like this every day and leave believing they deserved the way they were treated. Maria lowered her head immediately. Daniel stared at the floor. Even the guests nearby looked ashamed now, trapped in the uncomfortable truth of his words. Elijah glanced toward the black and white photographs lining the wall again. "My father cleaned construction sites at night so I could study during the day," he said quietly. "He used to come home with dust in his lungs and cuts on his hands." The lobby remained completely still except for the distant rain tapping softly against glass. "One day he told me luxury should never make ordinary people feel small." Elijah's reflection blurred slightly against the storm-dark window as water streamed down the glass. "I built these hotels because I wanted tired people to feel seen for one night." Victoria's lips trembled faintly. "Mr. Carter," Elijah raised one hand gently, stopping her before she could continue. "Not harshly. Just enough. Do not apologize because I own the building," he said softly. "Apologize because you forgot people are human before they are guests." The words seemed to hollow the air around her. Victoria looked down at the marble floor beneath her heels as if finally seeing the lobby clearly for the first time. Not as status. Not as prestige. Just a place where people arrived carrying invisible burdens. Elijah turned fully toward the room again. The soft amber chandelier light reflected across his face while thunder rolled faintly in the distance. "You know," he said quietly, "the strange thing about power is that it reveals people long before it changes them." No one spoke. No one dared interrupt the stillness settling through the lobby now. Elijah picked up his folded coat from the counter and draped it carefully over his arm again. Rainwater still glistened along the dark fabric under the warm lights. The older executive stepped closer. "Your suite is ready upstairs, sir." Elijah nodded once but did not move immediately. Instead, he looked toward Maria. "You were afraid tonight," he said gently. Maria swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Elijah gave a small nod filled with understanding instead of judgment. "Fear keeps people silent," he said softly. "But kindness is what tells them when to speak." Then the lobby fell quiet once more while the rain outside slowly began to soften against the towering glass windows of the Ashford Grand. The rain had almost stopped by the time Elijah Carter finally stepped toward the executive elevator. The storm clouds outside were beginning to thin above Manhattan, leaving faint ribbons of silver moonlight sliding across the wet streets below. Inside the Ashford Grand Hotel, the lobby no longer felt like the same place. The polished marble floors still gleamed beneath the chandelier. The piano music still drifted softly through hidden speakers. But the illusion of perfection had cracked, and everyone standing there could feel it. Elijah paused beside the elevator doors just as they slid open with a low mechanical hum. Warm golden light spilled from inside the private lift across the lobby floor. The older executive stepped aside respectfully. "The board is waiting on the 32nd floor, sir." Elijah nodded once but turned back toward the reception desk instead. Victoria Hale still stood frozen behind the marble counter, the termination documents untouched in front of her. Her makeup remained flawless. Her posture remained elegant. But her eyes no longer carried certainty. They carried fear. Not fear of losing status. Something deeper than that. The fear that comes when a person realizes they have become the very thing they once promised themselves they would never be. Elijah looked at her quietly. How long have you worked here? Victoria swallowed hard before answering. 8 years. And when did you stop seeing people? The question hit harder than any accusation could have. Victoria's lips parted slightly, but no answer came. Nearby guests remained completely silent now, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Maria stood motionless near the concierge station, her eyes shining beneath the warm lobby lights. Daniel Mercer rested both hands loosely in front of him, no longer standing like security but simply like a man ashamed of what he allowed himself to become part of. Elijah walked slowly toward the wall of framed photographs again. His reflection drifted faintly across the glass covering each black and white image. Ribbon cuttings. Charity galas. Smiling politicians. Wealthy investors. But Elijah stopped at one small photograph near the bottom corner of the display. It showed a group of construction workers standing beneath unfinished steel beams decades earlier. Their clothes were dusty. Their faces exhausted. One man near the back smiled proudly into the camera despite cement stains covering his hands. Elijah touched the edge of the frame gently with 2 fingers. That is my father, he said softly. The lobby remained completely still. He never stayed in this hotel after it opened. Victoria looked confused. Why not? Elijah gave a faint smile filled more with sadness than nostalgia. Because he said places like this were not built for men who looked like him. The words seemed to hollow the room from the inside. Maria lowered her eyes immediately. Even the businessman near the fireplace stared silently into his untouched drink now. Elijah glanced toward Victoria again. I spent 20 years trying to prove my father wrong. Rainwater still clung faintly to the edges of Elijah's coat beneath the chandelier light. The older executive beside him looked away respectfully, as though the moment belonged only to Elijah now. Victoria's voice trembled when she finally spoke. Mr. Carter. I truly am sorry. Elijah studied her carefully. For the first time that night, the apology sounded real. Not polished. Not strategic. Human. But he also understood something else. Regret did not erase harm. I believe you are, he said quietly. But apologies matter most when they come before consequences. Victoria closed her eyes briefly as the truth settled into her chest. Elijah looked toward Maria then. Effective tomorrow morning, he said calmly, all front desk and hospitality staff across every Ashford property will begin mandatory retraining. The older executive nodded immediately. Elijah continued softly, not on customer service. On dignity. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. Maria looked stunned. Elijah turned toward the elevator again, but before stepping inside, he glanced back one final time at the lobby. At the marble. The chandeliers. The frightened silence. A hotel should never decide who deserves warmth, he said softly. Then the elevator doors closed around him while the remaining rain outside slid silently down the towering glass windows of the Ashford Grand. The executive elevator carried Elijah Carter silently toward the 32nd floor while the city lights shimmered through rain-streaked glass behind him. Inside the elevator, the gold walls reflected his tired face from every angle. He loosened the collar of his charcoal shirt slightly and closed his eyes for one brief moment. The confrontation downstairs had drained something from him, not because of the disrespect itself, but because none of it had surprised him anymore. The older executive beside him remained respectfully quiet until the elevator chimed softly again. When the doors opened, warm light spilled across dark walnut floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Inside the private boardroom, 6 executives immediately rose from their seats. Half-finished coffee cups sat untouched beside glowing tablets and financial reports spread across the massive oak table. Good evening, Mr. Carter, one board member said carefully. Elijah nodded once but did not sit right away. His gaze drifted toward the city skyline beyond the glass. Rain still clung to the windows in thin silver lines, but the storm had mostly passed now. Far below, headlights moved through wet streets like rivers of white and gold. How long have the complaints been increasing? Elijah asked quietly. The room exchanged uneasy looks. A woman near the end of the table adjusted her glasses. Approximately 18 months, she admitted. Elijah remained facing the windows. And nobody thought to tell me the culture inside the properties was changing? The older executive finally spoke. We raised concerns twice during quarterly reviews, sir. Elijah looked back slowly. Concerns about service quality? Silence answered him first. Then the woman spoke again, more softly this time. Concerns about discrimination complaints. The room seemed colder suddenly despite the warm lighting. Elijah rested one hand against the back of a leather chair. How many? The executives hesitated again. One man cleared his throat uncomfortably before answering. 37 formal complaints across all Ashford locations over the last year. Elijah lowered his eyes briefly. 37. 37 people who walked away feeling smaller than when they arrived. 37 moments where dignity had been traded for appearances. And what happened to the complaints, he asked. No one answered immediately because everyone already knew the answer sounded ugly out loud. Finally the older executive spoke carefully. Most were settled quietly to avoid public attention. Elijah nodded once, slow and disappointed. Of course they were. The city lights reflected faintly across the polished table while silence stretched through the boardroom. Then Elijah pulled out a chair and finally sat down. Starting tomorrow, he said calmly, every property under the Ashford name will undergo immediate internal review. Several executives straightened immediately. All hiring policies. All management conduct reports. All guest complaint histories. His voice remained soft, but every word carried weight now. If people are being taught that wealth matters more than humanity, then we failed long before tonight. The woman with the glasses looked down at her notes. Publicly announcing reforms could hurt investor confidence. Elijah studied her quietly for a moment. Then perhaps our investors should ask themselves what exactly they invested in. Nobody challenged him after that. Outside the glass walls, the clouds slowly began breaking apart above the city skyline. Moonlight touched the wet rooftops below in pale silver bands. Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaustion visible now that the anger and tension downstairs had faded. Do you know what my father told me the day this hotel opened? He asked softly. The room remained silent. Elijah smiled faintly to himself. He walked through the lobby wearing his work boots because he had just finished helping install the marble floors. His eyes drifted toward the rain-streaked skyline again. A manager stopped him at the entrance and assumed he was lost. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Elijah continued quietly, my father laughed afterward and told me something I never forgot. He said, son, some people will spend their whole lives surrounded by beauty and still never learn how to see another human being. The room fell silent once more. Down below, somewhere far beneath the glass towers and polished marble, the Ashford Grand Lobby continued glowing warmly against the fading storm while Elijah Carter sat quietly at the head of the table, no longer thinking about profit margins or luxury branding, only about whether kindness could still survive inside the empire he had spent his life building.